On the 25th of May 2003, at Luanda's airport in Angola, a Boeing 727 with registration N844AA, a former American Airlines jet still bearing its faded livery, has been parked on the tarmac for approximately 14 months. The aircraft, which was owned by the US-based company Aerospace Sales and Leasing, was being prepared for repossession after a failed business arrangement involving fuel delivery operations. Shortly before sunset, somewhere between 5 and 6 p.m., two men were seen boarding the aircraft by eyewitnesses. Neither of them was fully certified to operate the 727 as the pilot in command. Without any clearance from the air traffic control, without filing a flight plan, and without any type of radio communication, the aircraft's engine started. Eyewitnesses report that it began taxiing erratically towards the runway. Air traffic controllers attempted to contact the aircraft, but they received no response. The aircraft then lined up on the runway, accelerated and took off, heading southwest, out over the Atlantic Ocean, with its lights and its transponder switched off. That was the last confirmed sighting of the aircraft. The 727 disappeared into the dusk, along with the two men on board. No distress calls were ever made. The unauthorized departure was reported almost immediately, and the next day on May 26, 2003, and in the days that followed, a major international search effort was launched. Several US law enforcement and intelligence agencies, including the FBI and the CIA, also got involved. Given the timing of this incident, which was just less than 2 years after September 11th, which happened in 2001, the vanishing of an American Airlines plane was highly concerning for the US, and it raised significant security concerns. So alerts were sent out to all the US embassies across Africa, instructing them to watch out for this specific aircraft, which obviously due to its size would require a much longer runway to land or store. But no wreckage was ever found. There was a reported sighting in Conakry in Guinea, which was just a few weeks later, and after investigation they dismissed that case. This intense multi-agency search continued without success in the weeks and months that followed. The Boeing 727 with registration N844AA and the two men who boarded it on that May evening in 2003 have never been seen again. The events of that evening marked the beginning of one of aviation's most perplexing disappearances. Now, the Boeing 727 was not a small aircraft. It was almost 47 meters long, and it had a wingspan of 33 meters, so it had a massive footprint. And this was the kind of aircraft that was designed to carry more than 100 passengers and cargo. So an aircraft of this size just vanishing is quite rare. When a plane of this size disappears, investigators usually hope to at least find something, whether that be in the form of debris or radar signals, emergency transmissions, or even a crash site. But in this case, investigators were left with almost nothing. And that absence created a question far larger than one missing airplane. For more than 2 decades, many questions remain unanswered. Before we examine anything further, we need to understand the location from which it disappeared from. Now, in 2003, Angola was emerging from nearly 3 decades of conflict. The Angolan civil war had officially ended only a year earlier, and for 27 years, fighting had consumed this country, leaving behind damaged infrastructure and economic instability. Roads had been destroyed and large areas still remained dangerous. Entire industries had spent years operating under pressure, and aviation was no exception to this. As the country was rebuilding itself, air travel had become critical, and many aid organizations were arriving, and aircraft from different operators, countries, and private companies were using the Luanda International Airport as their main hub. However, this had created an environment that had become difficult to monitor perfectly. The 727 that disappeared in 2003 was not actively flying any passengers. In fact, this missing 727 had become trapped inside a complicated story. The aircraft had reportedly accumulated substantial airport fees of almost $4 million and fuel bills which, at the time of the disappearance, were unpaid. There were also questions regarding ownership, as this aircraft had changed hands several times between different owners, and it had become entangled in business disputes and paperwork problems. So due to this, the aircraft wasn't really operating and it had been parked on the tarmac for almost 14 months. And that's what makes this even more strange. Usually missing aircraft disappear whilst crossing oceans or flying through storms. But this plane was not even in the sky. It was stationary for months, right in the middle of an international airport. Maybe this could have been the perfect environment for something to go unnoticed. To understand the mystery of this Boeing 727, we also have to talk about the two men who were supposedly on board that flight when it took off. Who had actually been on board that aircraft at the time it disappeared? Even 2 decades later, this basic detail has never been confirmed with absolute certainty. The two names that are most closely associated with the disappearance are Ben Charles Padilla and John Michael Mutandu. Ben was a 50-year-old American from Pensacola in Florida. He was a certified aircraft mechanic and he held an airframe and power plant rating. He was also a qualified flight engineer and a private pilot. Ben had extensive hands-on experience with this specific Boeing 727. However, he was never trained to fly this specific aircraft. John, on the other hand, was a mechanic from the Republic of Congo. He had recently been hired by Ben as a helper. Witness accounts from the afternoon of May 25, 2003 indicate that these two men boarded the aircraft just shortly before sunset. US authorities believe that Ben was likely at the controls, although neither man was certified or qualified to operate a 727 as the pilot in command. A standard 727 crew requires 3 trained professionals. The third one is usually a flight engineer. Now, the assumption that these two men were the only ones on board that aircraft, or even that they were definitely the ones who took it, rests primarily on their sudden disappearance at the exact same time as the aircraft went missing, and the eyewitness reports of the 2 people boarding. No other verified records confirm exactly who was in the cockpit when the jet taxied and departed without clearance. It's just that there wasn't much to work with because no flight plan had been filed, no destination had been officially recorded, no confirmed radio communications existed, there were no distress calls that had been transmitted from the aircraft. So investigators were essentially trying to follow an aircraft that had left no trail. And so we have to ask ourselves, was this plane actually intended to never be found? Now, there's been many theories as to what could have happened. So let's try and break some of them down and see if there's anything that we can find from them. One of the earliest theories to emerge was that this entire event was orchestrated as an insurance fraud scheme. At first glance, this idea sounds crazy, but a Boeing 727 is not a small aircraft. Hiding or disposing one off without trace is extraordinarily difficult, and it requires specialized fuel, secure runways, ongoing maintenance, and even a network of people with rare technical expertise. Even more rare in Western Africa back in 2003. However, this aircraft did have a troubled financial history, and it had accrued significant unpaid airport fees of almost $4 million, which had been generating massive losses for its owner, Aerospace Sales and Leasing, which back then was led by an individual named Maury Joseph. A previous leasing deal with a South African entrepreneur for fuel delivery to diamond mines had recently collapsed, with only partial payments received and ownership disputes lingering. As a result, the aircraft had sat in a state of disrepair, and its value had likely diminished after sitting idle in Angola's climate. But think of this, right? By 2003, aircraft like the 727 were tracked through detailed maintenance logs, serial numbered components on the engines, landing gear, avionics, and international registries. Insurance payments of any kind for an entire aircraft getting lost typically requires substantial proof, whether that be in the form of wreckage, a confirmed crash site, irrefutable evidence of theft, and some form of destruction. So, simply making this aircraft vanish without any wreckage made a successful insurance claim highly problematic. In fact, Maury Joseph, the president of Aerospace Sales and Leasing back then, never received any insurance payout. Earlier, as the CEO of Florida West International Airways, he had faced SEC charges that were related to falsifying financial statements and defrauding investors. This airline later went bankrupt, and Joseph was fined and barred from serving as an officer or a director of a publicly held company. This background naturally led some investigators and journalists to initially suspect possible insurance fraud or a staged disappearance in the 2003 incident. However, Joseph's actions after the disappearance contradicted those suspicions. He cooperated with the FBI and other investigators, volunteered for and even passed a polygraph lie detector test. If the goal was really fraud, then staging a controlled theft that left no paper trail, no wreckage for verification, and no way to collect insurance raises more questions than it answers. Why involve a visible, erratic daytime departure that was witnessed by people? Why not just arrange a more conventional loss or abandonment scenario that would have made it easier for the insurance to be paid out? In the early 2000s, particularly in parts of Africa still recovering from conflict, aviation networks sometimes operated in the shadows. Remote airstrips, limited radar coverage, and porous borders created conditions where aircraft could move goods, which included contraband such as drugs, across vast distances with reduced oversight. Now, the 727 had already been heavily modified for fuel transport. Most passenger seats had been removed and replaced with 10 fuel tanks, essentially turning it into a flying tanker for servicing remote diamond mining operations. This configuration had meant that the aircraft could carry substantial liquid cargo or be repurposed relatively easily for other bulk shipments if needed. With an estimated 53,000 plus or minus a few thousand liters of fuel on board at the time of departure, it had a theoretical range of almost 2,500 kilometers, which was enough to reach multiple neighboring countries or remote landing sites around Luanda. As this aircraft had sat idle for approximately 14 months in Luanda's tropical climate, this had likely led to degradation in critical systems, potential fuel contamination, hydraulic fluid issues, and corrosion in the airframe and engines. Operating such a jet would require reliable access to Jet A fuel in large quantities, specialized maintenance crews that were actually familiar with the 727's 3-engine Pratt & Whitney JT8P power plants, spare parts, and runways that were long enough to accommodate its takeoff and landing requirements. So the departure itself, with all of the erratic taxiing, no lights, no transponder, and a southwest heading over the Atlantic Ocean at dusk, so almost at the time of sunset, does not align perfectly with a planned smuggling pickup. Additionally, the two men on board, Ben Padilla and John Mutantu, had no known connections to smuggling networks, and neither of them possessed the full qualifications to operate the aircraft safely for extended periods of time. So, just like the insurance fraud theory, this explanation also raises more questions than it actually answers. To fully grasp why this disappearance triggered such an intense response, we must remember the timing of this, which was in May 2003. This was less than 2 years after the 9/11 attacks that happened in 2001 in New York. So at this time, in a post 9/11 world with commercial aircraft being viewed as potential weapons, a large jet that vanished without any form of authorization, communication, or a known destination immediately raised alarms at the highest levels of US intelligence. So when the reports reached Washington, D.C. that a 727 had been taken off unauthorized, the FBI and the CIA all became involved. Alerts were sent out to US embassies across Africa, and they were instructed to watch out for the aircraft as it required a long runway to land. There were even rumors back then of the US repositioning some of their fighter aircraft in Djibouti in case the aircraft had managed to cross across the African continent. The two individuals that were believed to be on board, Ben and John, they had no known ties to any terrorist organizations, and neither of them was actually fully qualified to fly that aircraft. So while the initial fear was understandable given that era, intelligence assessments quickly shifted as there was no supporting evidence that this had any links to any terrorism-related stuff. So by the June of 2003, the US State Department stated that it had no specific information linking this aircraft to any form of terrorism. Now, another theory that has persisted particularly among Ben's family is that the two men were actually not acting voluntarily. They may have been hijacked by unknown third parties who maybe forced them to board the aircraft and flight, because witnesses saw two men approach and board the 727 shortly before sunset. And while authorities believed these were Ben and John, the exact circumstances of the boarding have never actually been conclusively established. Family members, including Ben's sister, Benita Padilla, has publicly suggested that these men could have been threatened at gunpoint or ambushed after boarding the aircraft, with others already inside the aircraft or waiting nearby. The erratic taxiing that was observed could support the idea of panic or unfamiliarity in the cockpit when Ben and John realized that they were being hijacked. The issue with this, though, is that no group ever claimed responsibility, and no further use of the aircraft was ever detected. Extensive intelligent monitoring in the post-9/11 period found no links to any known criminal or terrorist networks that may have wanted to hijack this plane. One of the most grounded explanations is that Ben was simply trying to do his job. He may have attempted to fly the 727 out of Luanda as a legitimate effort to return the aircraft back to its American owner, Aerospace Sales and Leasing Company, only for the flight to end up in disaster. Now, Ben had been in Angola for roughly 2 months, specifically to oversee maintenance and prepare the plane for repossession. The owner of that company, Maury Joseph, had grown frustrated with the mounting parking fees and the stalled business deals. According to family members and some investigators, Ben was known as a resourceful hands-on mechanic who had worked on this exact aircraft before. He may have believed that he could safely fly this aircraft to a more stable location and hand it over to a qualified crew elsewhere. However, Ben was a certified flight engineer and mechanic. He was still not type rated to fly this 727. Operating this specific aircraft normally requires a 3-person crew, a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. And with only John assisting him, the workload in the cockpit would have been overwhelming, especially during the takeoff, climb, and the navigation phase of the flight, if they did actually manage to successfully fly it for longer than a few minutes. Take a look at this. This is the cockpit of the Boeing 727, and for someone who is untrained to fly this specific aircraft, this is not an easy layout of switches or controls to master and use appropriately. Also notice that this region over here is operated by a third person who is usually the qualified flight engineer with intricate knowledge of the systems of this aircraft. The erratic taxiing that was observed by witnesses and the complete lack of radio communication are consistent with an improvised high-stress departure rather than a calm, planned repositioning flight. If Ben was actually attempting a legitimate repossession of the aircraft, the absence of any prior coordination with air traffic control suggests that he may have felt he had no other choice. No distress calls were heard, which could indicate a sudden catastrophic failure just shortly after takeoff. In fact, it actually suggests that Ben and John were both well-meaning and they were willing to take a dangerous gamble to complete this assigned task. And the aircraft and both men in that process were lost. It still remains one of the explanations that is most supported by those who knew Ben personally. So with the limited flight experience on the type, possible weight and balance changes from the internal fuel tanks, potential mechanical degradation after prolonged inactivity, this aircraft could have actually ended up quickly in a crash. The vast South Atlantic Ocean that is just a few miles away from the airport offers an enormous search area where the aircraft could have sank. In fact, history has also shown that many aircraft, such as Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, have disappeared with wreckage only located years or decades later, if at all. But what makes this case so bizarre is that there is no confirmed debris or wreckage or any satellite detectable signals that have ever been reported, despite multi-agency searches in the weeks following the disappearance. If the plane flew further into the Atlantic before going down, the search area then expands dramatically into remote ocean regions where detection of this remains difficult even today. So to me, it aligns really well with the known risks of the situation, and it doesn't require any elaborate cover-up or an ongoing operation. But the total lack of any physical evidence after the extensive searches leaves even this straightforward possibility unproven. So After examining all the major theories and reviewing all the known facts, we arrive at the same place that investigators found themselves in more than 2 decades ago. We have an evidence board that is filled with competing possibilities and, unfortunately, very few clear answers. The disappearance of the 727 N844AA does not offer any clean resolution. Instead, each explanation solves some pieces of the puzzle, but at the same time, it creates new contradictions. After more than 2 decades, the 727 and the 2 men who boarded the aircraft on that evening remain missing until something concrete comes up, like wreckage, records, or maybe new testimony from witnesses who haven't yet spoken up. The final chapter of this story still remains unwritten. Thanks for watching.